There is a battle unfolding in silence, a war that does not announce itself with noise or chaos, but with whispers so subtle they feel like your own thoughts. It begins in moments you barely notice, small compromises, quiet distractions, a slow drifting away from prayer, from truth, from the fire that once burned within your soul. You don't wake up one day completely lost. You are led there step by step, thought by thought, until what once felt sacred becomes distant and unfamiliar. The enemy does not need to destroy you in a single blow. He studies your weaknesses, your wounds, your patterns, and patiently plants seeds of doubt, fear, and confusion. He disguises lies as comfort, temptation as relief, and distance from God as harmless independence. What feels like harmless delay becomes spiritual paralysis. What feels like a minor sin becomes a doorway. This is not just temptation, it is strategy. It is calculated, intentional, and deeply personal. And while you believe you are simply tired, distracted, or struggling, something far more dangerous is quietly at work, pulling you away from your purpose, dimming your discernment, and weakening your connection to the very source of your strength. Spiritual destruction rarely begins with a dramatic fall. It almost always starts with small, unnoticed compromises that seem harmless in the moment. It is the quiet decision to delay prayer just once, the subtle choice to ignore conviction, the willingness to entertain a thought you once rejected without hesitation. These moments appear insignificant, almost invisible, yet they carry the power to shift the direction of your entire spiritual life. The enemy understands that if he can get you comfortable with just a little, he can slowly lead you into far too much. At first, nothing feels different. You still believe, you still hope, you still think you are in control. But something begins to change beneath the surface. Your sensitivity to truth weakens, your hunger for God diminishes, and what once stirred your spirit now barely moves you. These compromises don't shout, they whisper. They convince you that missing one moment of obedience won't matter, that giving in this once won't affect your future, that you can always return later with no consequence. But every small compromise leaves a mark. It reshapes your thinking, dulls your discernment, and creates space for deeper compromise to take root. What once felt wrong begins to feel normal. What once convicted your heart now passes without resistance. The line between truth and deception becomes blurred, and you begin to justify what you once would have rejected. This is how the process works, quietly, patiently, strategically. The danger is not in the size of the compromise, but in its direction. Every step away from obedience, no matter how small, is still a step away from spiritual strength. The enemy does not need immediate destruction. He only needs gradual drift. He understands that if he can shift your focus slightly, over time, it will lead you far from where you were meant to be. A small deviation in direction can eventually result in a completely different destination. Compromise also weakens your spiritual authority. When you knowingly step outside of truth, even in the smallest ways, it creates an internal conflict that silences your confidence. You begin to feel unworthy, distant, disconnected. Your prayers lose their boldness. Your faith loses its clarity, and your ability to stand firm begins to erode. Not because you have been completely defeated, but because you have allowed small openings that the enemy can exploit. These compromises often come disguised as convenience or comfort. It feels easier to avoid discipline, easier to follow emotion, easier to choose what satisfies in the moment rather than what strengthens your spirit. But ease is not always harmless. What feels easy today can become bondage tomorrow. What feels like relief can slowly become dependency. Over time, the accumulation of these small decisions forms a pattern, and that pattern shapes your character. You are not changed overnight. You are shaped daily by the choices you make when no one is watching. The enemy relies on this consistency. He knows that if he can win in the small moments, he will eventually influence the larger ones. And before you realize it, what began as a minor compromise becomes a doorway to deeper separation, pulling you further from the presence, the power, and the purpose you were created to walk in. The enemy rarely approaches with obvious darkness. Instead, he works through subtle thoughts and quiet deception that blend seamlessly with your own inner voice. These thoughts do not arrive with warning signs or fear. They come gently, almost convincingly, sounding reasonable, logical, and even comforting. You begin to hear ideas that seem harmless, questions about your worth, doubts about your purpose, small justifications that slowly weaken your commitment to what is right. Because they feel like your own thinking, you rarely stop to challenge them. This is where the real danger lies. When deception feels familiar, it becomes easy to accept. A single thought like "you can pray later" or "this isn't a big deal" may seem insignificant, but it carries influence. It shifts your focus away from discipline and truth toward delay and compromise. Over time, these quiet suggestions form patterns in your thinking, and those patterns begin to shape your behavior. What started as a passing thought becomes a mindset, and that mindset begins to direct your decisions. The enemy understands the power of repetition. He plants the same subtle ideas again and again until they no longer feel foreign. Doubt, fear, insecurity, and confusion slowly take root because they are fed consistently. You may not even realize it is happening. You simply begin to feel less certain, less confident, less connected. Your clarity fades, and in its place comes a cloud of uncertainty that weakens your ability to stand firm in truth. These deceptions often twist what is good into something harmful. Truth is slightly altered, not completely denied. You are not told to abandon your faith. You are encouraged to become casual about it. You are not told to reject what is right. You are persuaded to delay it. This is how deception operates, not by forcing you into rebellion, but by gently guiding you away from conviction. It is a slow redirection that feels almost natural, making it difficult to detect. Another powerful aspect to this strategy is how it isolates you internally. As deceptive thoughts increase, they begin to shape how you see yourself and your situation. You may start to believe that your struggles define you, that your failures disqualify you, or that change is impossible. These beliefs are not truth, but when repeated often enough, they begin to feel real. And once you accept them, they limit your faith and weaken your resistance. The enemy also uses these thoughts to create emotional responses that reinforce the deception. Fear makes you hesitate. Doubt makes you question. Discouragement makes you withdraw. Each emotion strengthens the influence of the original thought, creating a cycle that becomes harder to break. You are not just thinking differently, you are feeling differently, and those feelings begin to shape your actions. What makes this approach so effective is its quietness. There is no dramatic moment, no clear line crossed. Instead, there is a gradual shift in perspective, a slow transformation of how you think, perceive, and respond. By the time you notice the impact, the deception has already influenced your habits, your priorities, and your spiritual sensitivity. It operates beneath the surface, shaping your inner world in ways that eventually manifest in your outer life. Distraction is one of the most powerful and underestimated weapons used against your spiritual life, not because it appears dangerous, but because it feels completely normal. It does not confront you with obvious temptation or direct opposition. Instead, it quietly pulls your attention away from what truly matters. Your focus begins to scatter across countless small things, tasks, entertainment, worries, responsibilities, until the time and energy that once belonged to your spiritual growth slowly disappears without resistance. It often begins innocently. You tell yourself you will pray later, reflect later, seek God when things calm down. But life rarely slows down on its own. The more you delay, the more your schedule fills with noise, and the easier it becomes to push spiritual discipline to the side. What was once a priority becomes optional, and what was optional becomes routine. Without realizing it, you begin to build a life where God is no longer at the center, but somewhere on the edges, waiting for whatever time is left. Distraction works because it does not feel like disobedience. You are not necessarily choosing what is wrong, you are simply neglecting what is right. This makes it harder to recognize the danger. You may still believe you are spiritually grounded, but your connection weakens as your attention is divided. Your mind becomes crowded, your thoughts become restless, and your ability to focus on truth begins to fade. In this state, even when you try to reconnect, you find it difficult to be still, to listen, or to feel the depth you once experienced. The enemy understands that a distracted mind is an unfocused spirit. When your attention is constantly shifting, you lose clarity. You become reactive instead of intentional. You begin to live from moment to moment, guided by whatever demands your attention most loudly rather than what matters most deeply. This creates a subtle form of control, where your life is no longer directed by purpose but by interruption. Distraction also weakens your spiritual awareness. When your mind is filled with noise, it becomes harder to recognize conviction, guidance, or warning. You may overlook important moments where you are being led to act, to pray, or to resist something harmful. The quieter voice of truth is easily drowned out by the constant activity surrounding you. Over time, this dulls your sensitivity and creates a distance that feels difficult to explain. Another danger is how distraction drains your spiritual strength. Your energy is finite, and when it is constantly spent on things that do not build your spirit, you begin to feel empty. You may feel tired without understanding why, unmotivated without clear reason, disconnected without knowing when it started. This exhaustion makes it even harder to return to discipline, creating a cycle where distraction feeds weakness, and weakness invites more distraction. What makes distraction so effective is its persistence. It is not a single moment, but a continuous pattern, a daily habit of divided attention. It keeps you busy but unfulfilled, occupied but spiritually dry. And while nothing may seem obviously wrong on the surface, something essential is quietly being lost, replaced by a life that looks full but lacks the depth, focus, and connection that once defined your walk. Sin rarely presents itself as something destructive. In the beginning, it often appears as comfort, relief, or a harmless escape from pressure. It appeals to your emotions in moments of weakness, offering what feels like immediate satisfaction when you are tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. In those moments, it does not look like rebellion or danger. It looks like rest, like ease, like something you deserve after everything you have endured. This is how it gains access, by meeting you at your lowest point and presenting itself as a solution rather than a threat. You may tell yourself that it is only temporary, that you need a break, that this one decision will not affect your spiritual life. It feels small, controlled, manageable. But what you fail to see is how it begins to reshape your desires. What once felt wrong starts to feel acceptable, and what once felt unacceptable slowly becomes something you seek. The comfort you thought you controlled begins to influence you in ways you did not expect. This is the deception. Sin does not immediately show its consequences. It hides the long-term cost behind short-term relief. In the moment, it soothes your emotions, quiets your stress, and gives you a sense of control. But beneath that surface, something deeper is happening. Your resistance weakens, your boundaries shift, and your sensitivity to conviction begins to fade. What once caused you to pause now passes without hesitation. Over time, this false comfort becomes a pattern. You begin to turn to it whenever you feel pressure, disappointment, or emptiness. Instead of seeking strength through truth, you seek relief through what feels easier. This creates a dependency that slowly replaces your reliance on spiritual discipline. You no longer fight as strongly because the alternative feels more appealing. The very thing that promised comfort becomes the thing that holds you back. Sin also changes how you perceive yourself. As you give in repeatedly, even in small ways, it creates an internal conflict. You may still desire what is right, but your actions begin to contradict that desire. This tension produces guilt, and that guilt can push you further into the very behavior that caused it. You begin to feel unworthy, distant, and less confident in your spiritual identity. Instead of running toward truth, you hesitate, unsure if you still belong in that place of strength. Another layer of this deception is how it isolates you. When you accept what is wrong as comfort, you begin to withdraw from what exposes it. You avoid moments of reflection, accountability, or honesty because they challenge the illusion. This isolation allows the pattern to grow unchecked. Without correction, what started as a small compromise becomes a habit, and that habit begins to shape your character. What makes this so dangerous is that it does not feel like destruction. It feels like relief, like something you need, like something that helps you cope. But while it appears to give you rest, it is quietly draining your strength, redirecting your focus, and pulling you away from the very source of true peace, leaving you searching for satisfaction in places that can never fully provide it. Distance from God rarely happens in a single moment. It unfolds gradually, almost imperceptibly, through a series of small shifts that seem harmless at first. You do not wake up one day completely disconnected. Instead, it begins with a slight change in priorities, a subtle loss of urgency, a quiet decision to place other things before what once mattered most. The change is so gentle that you hardly notice it, yet it begins to alter the rhythm of your spiritual life. At the beginning, your intentions may still be sincere. You still believe, you still value your connection with God, and you assume that everything will remain the same. But consistency begins to weaken. Moments of prayer become shorter or less frequent. Time spent in reflection is replaced by other distractions. What once felt essential slowly becomes optional. You tell yourself that you will return to it later, that this is only temporary, but later keeps moving further away. This gradual shift creates space, and in that space, other influences begin to grow. Your thoughts become more centered on daily concerns, your emotions more reactive to circumstances, and your focus more scattered. Without the regular presence of spiritual discipline, your inner strength begins to fade. You may not feel it immediately, but over time you notice a difference. You feel less grounded, less peaceful, less certain. The most dangerous part of this process is how normal it feels. Because the change is not sudden, it does not trigger alarm. You adapt to the new pattern without questioning it. You become comfortable with less connection, less clarity, less depth. What would have once concerned you now feels routine. This normalization of distance makes it harder to recognize how far you have drifted. As the distance grows, your sensitivity begins to decline. You may still hear truth, but it no longer impacts you in the same way. Conviction becomes weaker, and your response becomes slower. You begin to tolerate things you once resisted. Not because you have made a conscious decision to change your values, but because the connection that once strengthened those values is no longer as strong. This separation also affects your perspective. Without consistent alignment, your thinking becomes influenced by external pressures rather than internal truth. Fear, doubt, and uncertainty begin to shape your decisions. You may start to rely more on your own understanding, trusting what you see and feel instead of what you once believed with confidence. This shift makes you more vulnerable to confusion and less equipped to discern what is right. Another subtle effect is the loss of spiritual hunger. When you are close, there is a natural desire to seek, to grow, to deepen your connection. But as distance increases, that desire fades. You no longer feel the same urgency or passion. What once brought you life now feels distant or difficult. This lack of hunger reinforces the distance, creating a cycle where the less you engage, the less you feel compelled to return. Over time, this gradual drift reshapes your entire spiritual experience. You are still present, still aware, but no longer anchored in the same way. And while nothing dramatic may have happened, the accumulation of small shifts has led you to a place where your connection is weaker, your clarity is dimmer, and your strength is no longer what it once was. A lack of vigilance does not appear dangerous at first because it feels like rest, like a moment to ease your guard and relax your focus. You convince yourself that you do not need to be as alert, as disciplined, or as intentional as before. There is a quiet confidence that nothing will go wrong, that you can handle whatever comes, that you are strong enough to remain steady without constant awareness. But this is where vulnerability begins, not in weakness alone, but in the assumption that strength no longer requires protection. Vigilance is not about fear, it is about awareness. It is the ability to recognize what influences your thoughts, your emotions, and your decisions. When vigilance fades, that awareness begins to dim. You stop paying attention to the small things, the subtle shifts, the quiet changes that once would have caught your attention. What enters your mind goes unchecked. What shapes your perspective goes unexamined, and what affects your spirit goes unnoticed. This lack of attention creates openings, not large, obvious gaps, but small spaces where influence can grow without resistance. A thought that should be challenged is allowed to remain. A habit that should be corrected is ignored. A feeling that should be brought into the light is left to develop in the dark. These small allowances may seem harmless on their own, but together they form a pattern that weakens your inner strength. As vigilance decreases, your discernment begins to suffer. Discernment requires clarity, and clarity requires attention. When you are not actively engaged, it becomes harder to distinguish between what is true and what is misleading. You may begin to accept ideas, behaviors, or attitudes that do not align with what is right, not because you agree with them fully, but because you are no longer examining them carefully. This subtle shift makes deception easier to accept and harder to detect. Another consequence of lost vigilance is the erosion of discipline. Discipline is sustained by intention, and intention requires focus. When you are not paying attention, your actions become inconsistent. You begin to act based on convenience rather than conviction, responding to circumstances instead of directing them. Over time, this inconsistency weakens your ability to remain steady. You may still have the desire to do what is right, but without vigilance, that desire lacks the structure needed to be sustained. This state also affects your readiness. Without vigilance, you are unprepared for moments of challenge. When difficulty arises, you react instead of respond. Your thoughts become scattered, your emotions take control, and your ability to stand firm is reduced. Not because you lack strength, but because you were not actively maintaining it. Vigilance is what keeps your strength accessible, ready to be used when needed. There is also a quiet complacency that develops when vigilance fades. You begin to settle into a place where growth slows down and awareness becomes passive. You are no longer actively guarding your spiritual life. You are simply existing within it. This passive state allows influences to shape you without resistance, guiding your direction without your full awareness. Over time, this lack of vigilance reshapes how you think, how you respond, and how you live. It does not happen suddenly or dramatically. It happens gradually, through moments of inattention and choices left unchecked, until the sharpness of your discernment becomes dull and your ability to recognize what once stood out clearly begins to fade into uncertainty and hesitation. The reality of this battle is not meant to create fear, but awareness. What happens quietly can be confronted intentionally, and what has been weakened can be restored with purpose and discipline. Every compromise can be replaced with conviction, every deception can be exposed by truth, and every moment of distraction can be reclaimed through focus. The same subtle process that leads to spiritual decline can be reversed through consistent, deliberate choices that draw you closer to strength rather than away from it. You are not powerless in this fight. Awareness gives you the ability to recognize what once went unnoticed. Discipline gives you the strength to resist what once felt irresistible. And clarity allows you to see beyond the surface, understanding that every thought, every decision, and every habit carries direction. What you allow shapes you, and what you resist strengthens you. The battle is not about perfection, but persistence. It is about choosing truth when it is difficult, choosing focus when it is easier to drift, and choosing connection even when you feel distant. Every step matters, every moment counts, and every decision carries weight. What was once quiet and hidden loses its power when brought into the light, and what once weakened you becomes the very place where your strength begins to rise again.